And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan, and this is your Alaska aviation weather outlook on this Thursday, October 2nd. And to set things up, we are going to be watching an area of low pressure cross the western Aleutians Friday later morning, early afternoon, and that low will continue northeastward just west of St. Matthew outside of the Gulf of Anadyr. By the time we get into Saturday afternoon, this is going to force a windy front up along the southwest coast. And as a result, we'll see windy conditions, milder temperatures, and moist air that'll produce some rain showers or areas of rain. And then as we go through the weekend, some secondary moisture and a low pressure impulse will spread more moisture up through the western Gulf. In the short term, though, some pretty good rains this Thursday afternoon around Yakutat, and the rains are going to be heading southeastward across the Panhandle later this Thursday into Friday, with improving conditions across the northeastern Gulf Coast and Panhandle as we get into later Friday, as a ridge of high pressure nudges back up into that region. But we do find IFR conditions Friday morning around and north of the central upper Yukon Valley up toward the Brooks Range. We expect IFR conditions, the west arm of the Alaska Range down through Lake Iliamna, Wood-Tikchik State Park region just west of there, and then out from St. Paul on over toward the western Aleutians for Friday morning, and some IFR conditions up along the intercoastal mountains, the inner channel mountains there, British Columbia down in the Panhandle. Friday afternoon, pretty extensive IFR conditions along the central western Alaska Range. There is also still going to be some areas of snow, though they'll probably be tapering off a bit. Most of the snow that we're going to see here in the Alaska Range is falling yet into today, and then another batch coming through, especially the White Mountains to the north and northeast there of Fairbanks. Back to the west, IFR conditions, lower Yukon, out towards St. Lawrence, St. Matthew, and then down toward the central Aleutians. In fact, winds on Friday across the central Aleutians, storm force winds expected there, southerly storm force winds. And for Saturday morning, we find a broad area of IFR conditions between the Brooks Range and the Yukon River, extending out over a good part of the Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence, St. Matthew, Nunavik Island, down along the lower Yukon coast. The other thing, too, is with these stronger southeast-south winds, there could be elevated surf around Kuskokwim Bay. IFR conditions along and on the south side or Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula. And for Saturday afternoon, we find pretty extensive IFR conditions, western Gulf and down on the east side and south sides of Kodiak Island, as well as trailing out along the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula. We also have some IFR conditions, Cape Newingham up to north and northwest, up to about Bethel there, and then we have a broad area of IFR conditions along St. Matthew, St. Lawrence, the Bering Strait, Seward Peninsula, Kotzebue Sound, and along the spine and south slopes of much of the Brooks Range. Pass conditions for Friday, IFR will generally be the rule at Anatuvik Pass. That'll include some snow, Anatuvik and Adigan Pass, both IFR conditions with some lower ceilings and reduced visibility at times and some snow. Lake Clark, Merrill, generally IFR conditions expected there during the day Friday. Rainy Pass, IFR conditions as well. The Alaska Range at this time, this Thursday here, still picking up some accumulating wet snow. Windy Pass, MVFR becoming IFR on Friday, and as we go east, Isabel Pass, MVFR conditions. Further east, Mentasta Pass should become VFR in the afternoon, with MVFR conditions holding south entrance down into the Copper River Basin. Tanita Pass, generally MVFR conditions expected on Friday. And Portage Pass will start out with MVFR conditions becoming VFR as that area of low pressure along the northern Gulf Coast pulls eastward and takes the heavier precipitation currently falling in the northern northeastern Gulf Coast down across, sliding southeastward across the Panhandle. Chilkoot and White should generally see MVFR conditions for Friday. So looking at the freezing levels Friday morning, we find the surface freezing line down across the Seward Peninsula into areas of the central interior, of course around the Alaska Range and any of the mountains in the southern mainland. But otherwise, we find there is the warmer air aloft. There is the freezing levels aloft rise upward across the Gulf from 4 to 8,000 feet, and then above 10,000 feet as you get into the North Pacific, south of the Gulf. And then back here, we're watching that next area of low pressure beginning to it'll come across the western Aleutians Friday midday. And there are freezing levels aloft that'll be rising 10, 12,000 feet, especially there through the central and into the eastern Aleutians as that low in front works its way northeastward. So with that flow of moist air, the sea surface temperatures south of the Aleutians in the North Pacific are running some 5 to nearly 9 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. So this is going to help fuel the low pressure and provide ample moisture. We find there could be considerable moderate icing all along the central eastern Bering down through the Pribilovs and into the central eastern Aleutians. Freezing levels, though, the icing will be higher up above 12,000 feet along the central eastern Aleutians, above 8,000 feet Nunavik Island into around Kuskokwim Bay, and above 6,000 feet there could be moderate icing along the lower Yukon there in through the western interior. And then as we get up further north toward the Brooks Range, there could be some moderate icing above 4,000 feet. And then out here toward the Panhandle, there could be some moderate icing around Petersburg, Wrangell, down through Hyder, especially north and northeast of Ketchikan above 8,000 feet. And here is the jet stream pattern. We have an anticyclonically curved jet core and winds aloft 110 to 125 knots across the central mainland to along the Alcan border. Back to the southwest, winds are southwesterly out over the eastern Bering, upwards of 110 knots. At 9,000 feet, 700 millibars, there's a pretty strong core of winds of 50 to locally 75 to 80 knots over the lower, especially southeastern quadrant of the Bering Sea and along and just north of the eastern Aleutians. Out over the Alaska Range, coming down through the Chugach, Talkeetna Mountains, and then exiting out of Prince William Sound, northwest winds of 45 to 50 knots. At 3,000 feet, you can clearly see the broad circulation of this low that's going to be out there toward the central western Bering area. And ahead of it, core of strongest winds are 50 to 70 knots. They're just north of the central Aleutians out of the southwest. So pretty obvious where the problems of turbulence will be. On Friday, there could be severe turbulence in through the central Aleutians, trying to push eastward toward the eastward Aleutians, surface to 3,000 feet. Also some severe turbulence possible by afternoon around the Pribilovs at St. Paul. Otherwise, a broad area of moderate turbulence from St. Lawrence Island down through St. Matthew, back along the YK coastline, inland, up along into the west and northwest of the Alaska Range. Moderate turbulence, surface to 4, surface to 6,000 feet, and then potentially locally higher as you get up right along the back northwestward side of the Alaska Range. And then another area, there could be some moderate turbulence in the central southern Panhandle, surface to 6,000 feet on Friday.